Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Anton Warnchuk in Baltimore, and we're joined now by TRNN's senior editor, Paul Jay. Paul, thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you.
So what Paul and I are about to do is inaugurate this new series where we talk about how the mainstream media is covering the stories of the day and just how we think it should be covered. So let's get started. And let's start with something maybe a little bit banal, but let's talk about the weather. This month in Baltimore, we've seen days that are 70 degrees. And frankly, from the time that I lived in Baltimore, I didn't expect in February that I'd be able to wear a t-shirt outside or not wear a jacket. And this happening, I thought I'd take a look at the historic averages of temperature, in the month of February in Baltimore. And I saw that this month, I think all but 6 days have exceeded the historic average. Another thing I took a look at, I found in the Baltimore Sun in 2015 was the coldest February on record, which means quite a range of extremes. Now, based on this, how do you think the media is covering this event, this strange and fluctuating weather?
Well, we know 2016 was the third year of the three hottest years since we started keeping temperatures. We're in the midst of, if one is to believe the science, and if one believes the science in medicine, at least enough that you go to the doctor, and if you have cancer, you get chemo. If you have diabetes, you take medicine that's prescribed to you, along with exercise and things. Our daily lives are permeated with, we believe, the preponderance of science. It doesn't mean everything a doctor says is true, and it doesn't mean everything every scientist says is true. But, we know the Earth is round and not flat, so far. And I say so far because there's no such thing in science as absolute knowledge. And who knows, maybe we'll find out that the way we view the Earth, even from space, there's some weird optical thing happening. And in fact, it's not a circle. Maybe it's oblong. Who knows? It really doesn't matter. We only know one thing for certain, which is knowledge is relative. We can only know what's humanly possible at any given stage of history. And we come to know that when a preponderance of scientists, and when it comes to climate change, I think enough studies have shown it's in the range of 98 or 99% of scientists. When they say that this is a human-caused event, climate change, and they say the consequences are essentially apocalyptic if we don't do something about it, we know a study came out just before Christmas that said that we're going to hit the 2-degree threshold. That's 2 degrees of warming over pre-industrial revolution temperatures, which has been this threshold number that's been used for several years now. Because for a couple of reasons. One, by 2 degrees, weather starts to get even far more disturbed than we're already seeing now. But it's also kind of a tipping point that it's harder to come back and do something about the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Well, we could be hitting that 2 degrees by 2050, and that's a model before Trump was elected, at a time when the United States was likely to perhaps even meet the Paris Agreement, which everyone acknowledged was too low. In fact, this study said if every country that signed up for the Paris Accords actually fulfilled the Paris Accords, we would have still hit 2 degrees by 2050, and now it could be sooner. So how is the media covering this? Well, first of all, corporate media is just not covering it. There is virtually, there's a study, Media Matters did a study for 2015 that showed there was 149 minutes of coverage of climate change in the main television networks. And that included Fox, and those numbers were mostly saying there's no such thing as human-caused climate change. Other polling has shown that something like 16% of people polled when asked, will the effects of global warming affect you and your family? Only 16% of people thought it would directly affect them. There was a complete lack of sense of urgency. I talked to a guy just a couple of weeks ago who does fundraising for progressive causes, and was involved in the Sanders campaign and so on. And I told him about our wanting to create a climate change bureau, and he said, "Oh, well, that's really not a winner now." And I said, why? He says, well, everyone wants to get to the ACLU, and they all want to deal with the, violation of civil rights and the attacks that are coming on immigrants and so on. And of course, these are critically urgent things. But how do you not deal with what is going to be an existential threat to human civilization as we know it. And it's not very far away. This 2-degree thing's very, very, very short. So the corporate media, you have a bit of a chicken and egg or complementary lack of interest, which is when Obama was president and you had corporate Democrats running the government, they did the political calculation that people weren't all that interested in climate change, and it's not a good issue to really make a priority. The media doesn't cover it because no one in the level of presidential national politics is making an issue out of it, so they don't cover it. And then there's an underlying economic interest, both amongst the corporate Democrats and, of course, overtly the Republicans, who are outright climate deniers, which is, it's clear now that if you do want to deal with climate crisis in a way that actually is going to mitigate it and deal with the severity of the crisis, you've got to change the way the economy works. You can't have just a free-for-all capitalist model where fossil fuel interests can control much of the energy policy of the federal government. You can't have sections of finance that are very tied up with fossil fuel running politics, because you would have to change national priorities and start with, okay, how do you get off carbon? How do you have a green, sustainable economy? And those kinds of changes require a change actually in who has power. And so at the political level, the leadership of both parties won't deal with it. And then the media, one, because it's not part of the horse race discourse, they don't cover it. And then their ownership structure themselves are not interested in the kind of changes that would be required. If you remember in 07, 08, there was lots of coverage about climate change after the first United Nations IPCC report came out. Mainstream networks were covering this. It was on the front pages of magazines just prior to the crash, the 07, 08 economic crash, just prior. In fact, I remember being in Times Square and looking up at, I can't remember if it's ABC or NBC's right on Times Square. I think it's ABC, but you can see in their studios. And they're having a week-long special every night for a week, all about climate change. Now ABC, last year in 2015, did, I think it was 13 minutes and a whole year of coverage of climate change. So that's why we have this initiative to create a climate change bureau.
And I mean, even aside from the cable news networks, when I look at print publications, there is some reporting on climate change, but the way that I've seen it presented is usually when a record is broken, right? So, for example, like on month-to-month basis, I see, this month broke temperature records, this year broke temperature records. So it's for me, climate change, when it is even reported on a regular basis by print mediums, it's still at a level of abstraction. It's still at a level where the change is only seen as a statistical change, but it's not reported in such a way where people see that it's actually happening in their lives, that it's a real reality that they'd have to confront.
Yeah, if there was like some asteroid, like the kind of thing that scientists think wiped out the dinosaurs on its way to Earth, and even if they told us it was 30 years, 40 years, 50 years out, it would be a constant preoccupation that this asteroid's about to hit the Earth, and what are you going to do about it? You could send Bruce Willis up in a spaceship and throw a nuclear bomb on it. I don't know. But it'd be constant headlines. This asteroid coming, the asteroid's coming. Well, the reason it's not happening now with climate change is because there's too much economic interest in maintaining the status quo. And this is the most important point, is the wealthy people of this world, they think they're going to be okay.
Because right now, those who are suffering, don't get me wrong, there are millions of people who are already being affected by climate change, except there's one thing, it's that they're poor.
Yeah, poor people. Yeah, certainly the global south. And even in cities like Baltimore, you're going to see, like the FEMA has a flood zone in Baltimore. It affected our buildings. They wanted this, if we hadn't been designated historic, they were going to have us build, you couldn't start building till 8 feet above the sidewalk because they're worried about potential flooding. In New York, they're talking, in Manhattan, putting everything, they're not talking, they're actually planning for massive flooding where they're going to put stuff on pillars and things like that. But poor areas, no one's going to mitigate the poor areas. And especially in the global south, where places like Bangladesh, many places are either going to be flooded or they're going to have drought. But when you're wealthy and you're living in this bubble of wealth, either you just turn a blind eye to it, Two, you think I'll live in a gated community, and if I have to, it will be up on the top of a beautiful mountain. And I'll be all right, my kids will be all right, and frankly, they don't even look at what might happen to their grandkids and so on. So the point here is the solution, the sense of urgency, is not going to come from the elites, and it's not going to come from their media. It has to come from media like what we're doing and other independent media. And it's particularly difficult at this time of Trump. Because in spite of them being climate deniers, and you would think it would even bring more to the fore, this issue, because the administration, the Trump administration, is going to be gutting social safety nets and raising military budgets, and there's so many issues that seem more immediate that you can't get climate change again on the agenda.
Okay, so how is the Real News then covering this issue any differently than, let's say, MSNBC or the New York Times? Well,
when we first started producing Daily News in fall of 2007, the very first interview we did was with George Monbiot. And it was a series about climate change and the urgency of it. And in our first promotional video called The Promise, we said the most important story that we're going to do is climate change. But then we didn't. In truth, we didn't. I don't think me, fully internalized how urgent the situation was. We kind of knew it intellectually, but it was so easy and pressing to get caught up in the '08 election campaign and the issues that were being talked about, and issues of war and peace and poverty and so on, all critical issues of our time. That while we did regular climate change stories, and you know, I don't know how many we've done since then, 1,000 stories perhaps, and far more than certainly corporate news does, incomparably more, but not enough. Not with the intensity and urgency and daily beating of the issue. And that's why we want to get the Global Climate Change Bureau going, because we got to make this, you know, perhaps our #1 priority. As I say, you know, if there's going to be a war somewhere, you got to deal with it. If a president is attacking people's basic civil rights, you got to deal with it. But if life as we know it, if civilization's a threat, you know, it kind of is the issue. So we have to act that way more, and we're getting kind of building up our resources so we can do climate change every single day with the same kind of intensity we do, you know, other kinds of news. So I think we did better than most, but not as well as we could have or thought we would. And it's the same thing. There is a bit of feeling, it's a bit abstract because it's not right in your face. You know, you're not, and there is some underlying feeling here that I think we had sort of somewhat at a subconscious level, which is you kind of feel like if it's really that bad, even the capitalists are going to want to fix it. You know, they're not going to be so irrational, so crazy, that they would let this stuff happen without doing something about it. And they've got the resources to do the scientific investigation, whether it's geoengineering or whether it's some kind of mitigation, or even if it is, you know, some kind of carbon, you know, reducing carbon use. That, you know, would they really let something that's going to threaten their own society, that's making them wealthy? So you kind of feel like, no, even they'll do something about it, you know, in timely fashion enough. And then you start to realize, well, no, they're not going to. They're not going to threaten the who has power and how business is done here. They will let the planet go to hell because, as I said, they'll be okay. Their families will be okay, or they're just going to ignore it and put it out there, out of mind, out of sight. Or is it the other way, out of sight, out of mind? And they're not going to do it. And if there was ever an issue, and it's true for most issues, if not all, but certainly this one, where ordinary people have to get organized and demand solutions and elect people, you know, like if you're not going to be serious about climate change, people, you know, we're not going to vote for you. If you're not serious about a change in developing a green, sustainable economy, we don't care whether you call yourself a Democrat or anything else. Like, until there's that kind of level of focus on this, there needs to be millions of people in the streets about this issue. And why there isn't is partly a media question, because it's just too much media is ignoring it.
All right, thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
And if you have any questions for us, how we cover things, what we should cover, how we should be doing it, you can send them to contact@therealnews.com. You can send it to our Facebook or to our Twitter. So thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.